The city streets whispered stories of desperation, their echoes bouncing off the cold gray facades of abandoned storefronts and bustling convenience stores. It was a damp evening. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the pavement remained slick, reflecting the faint glow of streetlights and neon signs. Cars rushed by, splashing water onto the sidewalks, their drivers oblivious to the world outside their metal cocoons. The air carried the smell of gasoline and damp concrete, um, a concoction that spoke of industry and indifference. Amid this urban chaos sat Joseph, a man almost invisible to the world. His face, framed by a scraggly beard, was weathered and tired, each wrinkle a story of struggle. His once pristine coat was now a tattered shield against the biting cold. In his hands, chapped and trembling, clutched a piece of cardboard. The words scrawled in uneven black marker read, "Need help, anything counts." Beneath the sign, a small coffee cup sat, its contents an insulting mixture of pity and compromise. Joseph wasn't always like this. There was a time when he wore suits instead of layers of old, mismatched clothing. There was a time when he smiled without it being a defense mechanism. But life had a cruel way of unraveling stability. The tragic car accident that took his wife and daughter left him hollow, a shell of the man he used to be. Bills piled up, jobs disappeared, and soon he was out on the streets, learning to survive in a world that often mistook struggle for laziness. Tonight was like any other. The occasional pedestrian glanced at him with a mixture of guilt and discomfort, hurrying past as though his neediness might be contagious. Few offered the spare change they could afford, but most offered nothing at all, just averted eyes. Joseph didn't blame them. It was easier to look away. From the distance, the rhythmic sound of boots striking the pavement broke through the ambient noise. It was Officer Brad. His presence was as cold as the wind that swept through the street. Brad was a seasoned cop, but he carried with him a bitterness that seeped into his work. Known for his harsh treatment of the marginalized, Brad had built a reputation that oscillated between fear and disdain among the city's less fortunate. As Brad walked toward the convenience store, his sharp eyes caught sight of Joseph. His lips curled in a smirk, the kind that carried no humor. To him, Joseph wasn't a man. Not really. He was a nuisance, a blemish on the city's image. Brad adjusted his belt and approached with an air of authority that turned heads. Joseph felt the looming presence before he saw it. Looking up, his eyes met Brad's, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. This was the beginning of something neither of them could foresee. A moment that would ripple through their lives and the city itself. The tension in the air was almost tangible as Officer Brad towered over Joseph, his shadow stretching across the dimly lit sidewalk. The city's usual cacophony, honking cars, murmuring pedestrians, distant sirens, seemed to fade into the background as the confrontation began to take shape. Brad's boots stopped just inches from Joseph's makeshift sign. He adjusted his belt with deliberate slowness, his expression cold and unreadable. "You again," Brad muttered, his voice carrying the clipped tone of someone accustomed to giving orders. It wasn't the first time you had seen Joseph. Over the past few months, their paths had crossed several times, each encounter marked by Brad's disdain and Joseph's quiet endurance. Joseph looked up, his tired eyes meeting Brad's sharp gaze. For a moment, there was silence, a fleeting standoff between two lives shaped by vastly different circumstances. "I'm not bothering anyone," Joseph said softly, his voice steady despite the gnawing pit in his stomach. He lowered his gaze, focusing on the pavement, the only escape from the judgment in Brad's eyes. Brad smirked, but there was no humor in it. "Not bothering anyone?" he repeated mockingly, his words dripping with contempt. He gestured around with exaggerated flair, drawing the attention of a few onlookers. "You're loitering, you're begging, and you're making this place look like a dump." Joseph flinched at the words but remained silent. He had heard worse, endured worse. His silence seemed to frustrate Brad, who leaned closer, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Why don't you pack up and crawl back to whatever alley you came from? You people are all the same. Nearby, a woman holding a grocery bag paused, her brow furrowed as she watched the interaction. A young man with headphones around his neck pulled out his phone, quietly recording. Others passed by, some stealing quick glances, others pretending not to notice. I have nowhere else to go, Joseph replied, his tone even but weary. His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring Brad to acknowledge the truth. But Brad didn't see a man in need. He saw defiance, and it ignited something dark within him. I'm starved. In one swift motion, Brad's boot lashed out, knocking over Joseph's coffee cup. The coins spilled across the wet pavement, scattering like fallen leaves. The kick wasn't hard enough to cause serious harm, but it carried a message. One of dominance, humiliation, and raw power. A collective gasp rose from the small crowd now gathering. The woman with the grocery bag clutched it tighter, her eyes wide with disbelief. The young man recording took a step closer, his phone capturing every second. When do we ever get a message in the summer, man? Joseph didn't react immediately. He stared at the spilled coins, his expression unreadable. Slowly, he reached out to pick them up, his trembling hands betraying the storm brewing inside him. But he didn't look at Brad. He didn't need to. The crowd's murmurs were growing louder, their disapproval evident. Brad, noticing the attention, straightened his posture, his smirk faltering for the first time. "Move along," he barked, his voice rising to mask his discomfort. But the damage was done. The bystanders weren't moving. They were watching, recording, and judging. As Joseph collected the last coin, he finally spoke, his voice low but firm. "One day, you'll see. People like me aren't the problem. People like you are." The words struck Brad harder than he expected, but he dismissed them with a scoff. Turning on his heel, he walked away, his boots echoing against the pavement. Behind them, the young man posted the video to social media with a single caption: "Racist cop kicks homeless man." The ripples of that moment would soon become a tidal wave. But for now, Joseph sat back down, clutching his sign. The world had already begun to change, and neither man realized just how much. The sign read, "Green parking for cars and live ants, for businesses closed and vacations laid. More important, less lives." The city continued its restless churn, unaware that a single video was about to break the monotony of its daily grind. It began innocently enough, just a post by a young man on his social media account. The caption was simple, yet incendiary. "Racist cop kicks homeless man." And beneath the words was the shaky, unfiltered footage of Officer Brad kicking over Joseph's cup of coins. The harsh sound of coins scattering, amplified by the silence that followed. Within minutes, the video began to gain traction. At first, it was shared among friends and acquaintances, sparking outrage in small circles. "This is disgusting," one comment read. "How can anyone treat another human being like this?" wrote another. As the shares multiplied, so did the anger, and soon the video had transcended its humble beginnings, finding a home on major platforms. Joseph, however, remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He had no phone, no social media presence, no idea that his quiet suffering had become a symbol of resilience and injustice. He sat in his usual spot outside the convenience store, unaware that the world was now watching his every move. The media wasn't the only entity paying attention. The city's mayor held a press conference, visibly uncomfortable as he addressed the issue. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice measured but firm. "The actions displayed in that video do not reflect the values of our city or its police department. An internal investigation is already underway." Meanwhile, Officer Brad was beginning to feel the heat. By mid-morning, his superiors had called him into the station. He sat stiffly in the chief's office as a stern voice read aloud excerpts from the public's reactions. "You've put this department in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons," the chief said, his tone laced with barely contained anger, Until further notice, you're suspended. Joseph, however, remained oblivious to the storm brewing around him. He had no phone, no social media presence, no idea that his quiet suffering had become a symbol of resilience and injustice. He sat in his usual spot outside the convenience store, unaware that the world was now watching his every move. The media wasn't the only entity paying attention. The city's mayor held a press conference, visibly uncomfortable as he addressed the issue. "Let me be clear," he began, his voice measured but firm. "The actions displayed in that video do not reflect the values of our city or its police department. An internal investigation is already underway." Meanwhile, Officer Brad was beginning to feel the heat. By mid-morning, his superiors had called him into the station. He sat stiffly in the chief's office as a stern voice read aloud excerpts from the public's reactions. "You've put this department in the spotlight for all the wrong reasons," the chief said, his tone laced with barely contained anger. "Until further notice, you're suspended." Brad's smug facade cracked under the weight of scrutiny. His inbox was flooded with hate mail, his name trending for all the wrong reasons. Former colleagues distanced themselves, while old complaints of misconduct began to resurface, dredged up by internet sleuths hungry for more dirt. Back on the streets, Joseph's life took an unexpected turn. Strangers approached him with food, blankets, and words of encouragement. "I saw the video," one woman said, placing a steaming cup of coffee in his hands. "You didn't deserve that." Joseph accepted the gesture with quiet gratitude, still struggling to understand the whirlwind around him. As the day wore on, Joseph's name became synonymous with a larger movement. Online petitions called for Brad's termination, while grassroots activists began organizing rallies. One particularly impassioned post read, "Joseph is every homeless person we ignore, every injustice we let slide. This stops now." By nightfall, the video had reached the desks of national news anchors, clips of Joseph sitting silently as Brad's boot struck his cup played on repeat, accompanied by somber commentary about societal inequality. Joseph's silence, once ignored, now spoke volumes. And in the midst of it all, the world waited to see what would happen next. For Joseph, for Brad, and for a system that seemed to be on the brink of reckoning, Barb's to 7 years old, for nearly a decade. The world now knew Joseph as the man from the viral video, but the truth of his life remained a mystery. Who was this quiet, stoic figure who had endured such humiliation without lashing out? The answers lay in a past filled with love, loss, and a resilience forged in the fires of tragedy. Years ago, Joseph was a man with a life that seemed, from the outside, unremarkably stable. He lived in a modest suburban home with his wife Amelia and their daughter Sophie. Now, Amelia was the kind of woman who could light up a room with her laugh. Her presence a balm for Joseph's weary soul after long days at the factory where he worked as a mechanic. Sophie, with her curls and mischievous smile, was the center of his world. Together they formed a family that didn't have much, but had everything they needed: love, trust, and each other. Life wasn't easy, but Joseph was a provider. He worked overtime shifts to save up for Sophie's education, determined to give her a future far brighter than his own. The weekends were sacred, filled with trips to the park, Sunday morning pancakes, and the kind of moments that quietly define happiness. But life, as Joseph would learn, had a cruel unpredictability. It was a rainy evening, eerily similar to the night of the incident when tragedy struck. Amelia and Sophie were driving home from Sophie's piano recital when a drunk driver ran a red light. The collision was devastating. Joseph arrived at the hospital to the sterile smell of antiseptic and the crushing news that both his wife and daughter were gone. Joseph would later say that the night before we had a conversation about our daughter be a part of our life for the next 70 years, and everyone was amazed. Lucky y'all came home. That Sophie was driving her dark-lit red car got C-checked. His world, once filled with laughter and light, crumbled in an instant. Grief swallowed Joseph whole. For weeks he functioned on autopilot, going through the motions of work and life but feeling utterly hollow. Friends and coworkers offered their condolences, but the words felt like echoes in an empty room. Bills began to pile up as Joseph missed work, unable to focus, unable to care. Depression tightened its grip, and soon the home that had been filled with so much love was sold to pay debts. The house keys felt heavy in his hand as he turned them over to a realtor. A final goodbye to the life he had known. Joseph tried to rebuild, but the pieces never fit back together. Odd jobs came and went, each one ending as his grief interfered with his ability to function. Slowly, the safety net unraveled. Without a job, without a family, and with nowhere to turn, Joseph found himself on the streets, a place he never thought he would be. Yet even in his lowest moments, Joseph clung to a flicker of hope. He carried with him a small, worn photo of Amelia and Sophie, their faces a reminder of the love he once had. He spent his days quietly observing the world, finding solace in small acts of kindness. A passerby who dropped $1 into his cup, a warm smile from a stranger. Joseph never begged aggressively or drew attention to himself. His dignity was his last possession, and he held it tightly, even as the world around him ignored his existence. So now, with the world suddenly watching, Joseph's story began to emerge. A local reporter, digging into his past, unearthed the details of his life. The factory job, the car accident, the downward spiral. The article painted him not as a man to pity, but as a man to respect, someone who had endured unimaginable loss and still managed to face each day with quiet strength. As people read about Joseph's life, the video of his humiliation took on a deeper meaning. He wasn't just a homeless man kicked by a cop. He was a husband, a father, a human being who had faced life's harshest trials and survived. For Joseph, the past was a weight he carried every day. But as his story unfolded for the world to see, it became something more. A testament to resilience and a call to action. Man the world had overlooked was now a symbol, and his story was far from over. The video spread faster than wildfire, and Officer Brad found himself at the center of a storm he never expected. By the next morning, his name was plastered across headlines, trending hashtags, and viral posts. The faces of local news anchors framed his image alongside the damning footage of his kick, the sound of coins scattering like thunder in the court of public opinion. Brad had spent his career believing he was untouchable, a figure of authority beyond reproach. But now, the world was watching, and they were demanding justice. The day started like any other for Brad, but he quickly realized this was no ordinary shift. As he stepped into the precinct, the usual camaraderie of his colleagues was replaced with side eyes and muttered conversations. The chief called him into his office almost immediately, slamming the door behind him. "What were you thinking?" the chief barked, pacing the room. A copy of the morning paper lay open on his desk, the headline bold and accusing. "Officer kicks homeless man. Caught on camera." The accompanying still from the video captured Brad mid-action, his face twisted in an expression that now seemed sinister in the harsh light of public scrutiny. "Been blown out of proportion," Brad said defensively, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. He crossed his arms, his attempt at defiance faltering under the chief's glare. "Blown out of proportion?" the chief spat. "Do you know how many calls I've taken since last night? From reporters? From the mayor's office? We've already gathering outside City Hall. We've gotten Rebecca's voices. It's out of control. We've been going back a month, maybe even 2. We haven't been stopped since the day we decided to make this team our own." Brad felt a flicker of panic at the mention of internal affairs. His mind raced, trying to construct a defense, but the chief wasn't finished. "You're suspended, effective immediately," the chief said, his tone final. "Turn in your badge and gun. IA will be in touch." Brad's face flushed as he unhooked his badge and holster, placing them on the desk. The walk out of the chief's office was humiliating, his colleagues pointedly avoiding his gaze. For the first time, Brad felt the sting of being judged, of being on the wrong side of authority. At home, The isolation was even worse. Brad's phone was flooded with messages, angry calls from strangers, threatening voicemails, and hateful texts. His name was being dragged through the mud online, with people from all walks of life sharing their own stories of being mistreated by cops like him. Former colleagues distanced themselves, while even old friends refused to answer his calls. His once proud career now felt like a house of cards collapsing under the weight of public outrage. But the reckoning didn't stop there. Internet sleuths dug into Brad's past, unearthing complaints of excessive force and racial profiling. Though these incidents had been swept under the rug by the system that protected him, they now resurfaced with a vengeance, fueling the narrative of a corrupt cop who had finally met his downfall. As the days passed, Brad found himself alone with his thoughts for the first time in years. The silence was deafening, forcing him to confront the person he had become. He replayed the video in his mind over and over until the moment of the kick haunted him. In Joseph's eyes, he saw something he hadn't noticed before: pain, dignity, and a quiet strength that made Brad feel small. But now, stripped of his badge and the shield it provided, he saw them for what they were: abuses of power driven by his own prejudice and insecurities. He had become the very thing he had sworn to stand against: an agent of injustice. The world outside continued to rage, with protests, petitions, and news coverage demanding accountability. But inside his apartment, Brad sat in silence, wrestling with the realization that his reckoning had only just begun. The days after his suspension were a blur of silence and shame for Officer Brad. His apartment, once a refuge, now felt like a prison. The curtains stayed drawn and the TV played on mute as the news cycle replayed the video of his actions over and over. He had thought himself untouchable, a guardian of the law. Now, stripped of his badge, he was left alone to confront the harsh truth. He had become the villain in his own story. The realization hit hard as late one night. Scrolling through his phone, Brad stumbled upon an interview with Joseph. Seated on a worn chair in a local shelter, Joseph spoke softly but firmly. He didn't talk about the kick, the humiliation, or even Brad by name. Instead, he shared his story: his wife, his daughter, and the cruel spiral that had led him to homelessness. Joseph's voice cracked only once when he said, "I lost everything, but I still believe in kindness. Sometimes it's all we have." Brad stared at the screen long after the interview ended, Joseph's words echoing in his mind. He thought of the faces he had ignored during his patrols, the lives he had dismissed as burdensome, and the unchecked anger that had governed his actions. For the first time, Brad felt not defensive, but ashamed. The next morning, he made a decision. Brad reached out to a community organization that worked with the homeless, introducing himself hesitantly as just a guy trying to make amends. The coordinator, a woman named Linda, looked him up and down, her eyes narrowing with suspicion. "You're the cop from that video, aren't you?" she asked bluntly. Brad nodded, his voice steady but quiet. "Yes, and I want to do better." Linda didn't offer him a warm welcome, but she agreed to let him volunteer. "Let's see if you mean it," she said. And so, Brad began showing up every morning, stacking shelves in the food pantry, serving meals, and listening. Really listening to the stories of those who came through the doors. For the first time in years, he was seeing the humanity in the faces he had once dismissed. His transformation wasn't instant, nor was it easy. The whispers and glares from the people he served were a constant reminder of his past. Some refused to accept help from him. Others confronted him, forcing him to reckon with the pain he had caused. But Brad didn't turn away. He listened, he apologized, and slowly, he began to learn. The real turning point came when Brad sought out Joseph. It took weeks to find him, and when he finally did, Joseph was sitting in a park, handing out sandwiches to other homeless individuals. Brad approached cautiously, his heart pounding. "Joseph, he began, his voice unsteady. "I owe you an apology. I was wrong. completely, utterly wrong. Joseph looked up, his eyes searching Brad's face. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then, to Brad's astonishment, Joseph extended a hand. "It takes courage to admit that," Joseph said simply. "What matters now is what you do next." That handshake marked the beginning of something new. Brad continued volunteering, but now with Joseph as a mentor, guiding him to understand the systemic issues that created the very situations he once punished. Together, they worked to organize workshops, bring attention to the plight of the homeless, and bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. For Brad, redemption wasn't a destination, it was a journey. Every meal served, every conversation had, and every barrier broken became a step toward healing. He couldn't erase his past, but he could build a future that honored the humanity he had once ignored. And in the eyes of the people he once overlooked, Brad saw something he hadn't seen in years: hope. The storm that had begun with a single kick transformed Joseph's life in ways he never imagined. For years, he had been invisible, a face in the crowd, a man defined by his circumstances. Now, he was a symbol of resilience, a voice for the voiceless, and a beacon of hope for a society forced to confront its own indifference. It began with small acts of kindness from strangers. People had seen the viral videos, sought him out, offering food, clothing, and words of encouragement. At first, Joseph was overwhelmed, unsure how to accept the attention. "I don't need much," he would say, his voice gentle but firm. But they insisted, not just because they wanted to help him, but because they saw in him something they wanted to honor: dignity in the face of adversity. Then came the offers of support from larger organizations. A local shelter director reached out, offering Joseph a place to stay and a chance to rebuild. With hesitant steps, he accepted, moving into a small but clean room with a bed, a desk, and a window that overlooked the park where he had often sat. It wasn't much, but to Joseph, it felt like the first step toward reclaiming his life. Joseph's story began to spread beyond the city. A journalist, deeply moved by his quiet strength, published an in-depth profile of his life. The article painted a vivid picture of a man who had loved and lost, who had been failed by the system, but who had never lost his humanity. It wasn't a story of pity, it was a story of perseverance. The headline read, "From the streets to the spotlight, the man who made us look again." The article sparked something Joseph hadn't felt in years: purpose. Invitations poured in from community groups and advocacy organizations asking him to speak. At first, Joseph hesitated. Public speaking was foreign to him, and he wasn't sure what he had to offer. But a part of him knew this was bigger than him. If his voice could spark change, then it was worth the discomfort. His first speaking engagement was at a small community center performed by a community center. Gropes came in the window shouting, "Resolution! Resolution!" In his center, Gropes became a panic enthusiast. Nervous but determined, Joseph stepped onto the stage, clutching a microphone. The audience fell silent as he began to speak. He told them about Amelia and Sophie, about the accident and the spiral that had left him on the streets. But he also spoke about the people who had shown him kindness when he had nothing, and about the power of empathy in a world that often seemed devoid of it. "I'm not here because I'm special," Joseph said, his voice steady. "I'm here because someone decided to see me when I felt invisible, and that's what we need to do for each other. See each other." The room erupted in applause, and Joseph felt something he hadn't in years: pride. From that moment on, he became a sought-after speaker, sharing his story at schools, town halls, and even national conferences. His words inspired policy changes, including increased funding for homeless shelters and programs aimed at breaking the cycle of poverty. But Joseph's rise wasn't just about public appearances. He became deeply involved in grassroots efforts, partnering with organizations to create job training programs for the homeless and lobbying for affordable housing initiatives. He worked tirelessly not because he wanted recognition, but because he understood what it felt like to be forgotten. One day, as he walked through the park where he had once begged for change, Joseph saw a young man sitting on a bench, holding a sign that read, "Need help, anything counts." Without hesitation, Joseph approached him, sitting down beside him. "I've been where you are," Joseph said, his voice kind but firm. "And I can tell you this isn't the end of your story. It's just the beginning." For Joseph, his rise wasn't about escaping his past. It was about using it to lift others. He had found his purpose. And in doing so, he became not just a man who had survived, but a man who inspired others to thrive. The ripple effect of Joseph's story swept through the city like a tidal wave, touching lives far beyond the corners where he had once sat with his humble sign. What began as a moment of injustice, captured on a shaky phone camera, became a catalyst for change that no one could have foreseen. The first signs of transformation appeared quietly. At City Hall, petitions with thousands of signatures demanded reforms in law enforcement and greater support for the homeless. Activists, fueled by Joseph's resilience, organized rallies under banners that read "Dignity for all and justice, not prejudice." These rallies weren't just gatherings of anger. They were calls for action filled with speeches, stories, and a shared determination to rebuild a fractured system. The police department, under intense scrutiny, announced mandatory diversity and sensitivity training for all officers. More importantly, they began partnering with community organizations to develop protocols for engaging with vulnerable populations. The program, named Human First, was designed to teach officers empathy, active listening, and de-escalation techniques. Joseph himself was invited to speak at the launch, sharing his experience and emphasizing the importance of seeing the humanity in every individual. But the changes weren't confined to policy. On the streets, a new sense of awareness began to take root. Local businesses started leaving small baskets of food and water outside their doors for those in need. Passers-by who had once averted their eyes now stopped to offer a kind word or a helping hand. The city, once defined by its indifference, began to cultivate a culture of care. One of the most profound changes occurred within the education system. Inspired by Joseph's story, teachers and students launched initiatives to address homelessness. High schoolers organized donation drives connecting blankets, clothing, and hygiene products. In classrooms, discussions about systemic inequality replaced outdated lectures, empowering a new generation to think critically about societal issues. A young girl during a school assembly stood up and said, "Joseph taught me that everyone deserves to be seen. We can't fix what we ignore." Joseph's rise also sparked a movement among the city's homeless population. Many who had felt defeated and voiceless found inspiration in his story. Shelters reported an increase in people seeking resources to rebuild their lives, and local organizations were overwhelmed with volunteers offering to mentor and support those in need. Joseph, now a familiar face at these shelters, often sat down with individuals and listening to their stories and offering words of encouragement. Also became the most significant victories came when the city council approved a plan to build affordable housing complexes funded by public and private partnerships. The initiative, named Sophie's Haven in honor of Joseph's late daughter, became a symbol of what could be achieved when a community united for a common cause. The housing project included job training centers, counseling services, and childcare facilities, giving families a real chance to escape the cycle of poverty. Even Officer Brad played a part in the transformation. No longer a figure of scorn, he became a living example of redemption, volunteering at shelters and advocating for police reform. His presence at community events alongside Joseph became a powerful symbol of reconciliation and the possibility of change. The city that had once turned its back on Joseph now stood as a testament to his strength and humanity. It wasn't perfect, no city ever is, but it was better. And it wasn't just Joseph who had risen. It was an entire community lifted by the belief that even the smallest acts of kindness could spark monumental change. As Joseph walked through the bustling streets one crisp morning, he saw the familiar faces of people who had once ignored him, now nodding in recognition and respect. A young boy tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered, "That's him. That's the man who changed everything." Joseph smiled, his heart full. The community hadn't just transformed. They had finally learned to see. The city was different now. You could feel it in the way people moved and how they spoke to one another. It wasn't perfect. Life never is. But there was a sense of something new, something better. The viral video that exposed cruelty had become the spark for change, and at the heart of it all was Joseph. On a sunny afternoon, Joseph stood in front of a small crowd in the park, very place where he had once sat invisible to the world. Now the park was alive with families, children laughing, and people exchanging warm greetings. Joseph had been invited to speak at the opening of the new affordable housing complex named after his daughter, Sophie's Haven. Taking a deep breath, Joseph looked at the people gathered before him. Many faces were familiar, and even Officer Brad, who stood quietly at the back, nodding in support. Joseph held the microphone tightly and began to speak, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I never thought I'd stand here today. For a long time, I felt like the world had forgotten me." Joseph smiled, the lines on his face softening as he continued. "This place, Sophie's Haven, is more than just a building. It's a second chance. A place where people can rebuild their lives, just like I've been able to. And it's named after my little girl because she taught me the most important thing of all. Love can survive anything, even the hardest times." After his speech, Joseph stepped down to a sea of applause. People came up to thank him, to shake his hand, to tell him how his story had touched their lives. A young woman approached with tears in her eyes. "Your story made me see my dad differently," she said. "He's homeless, and I stopped talking to him, but I'm going to find him now. Thank you for helping me understand." Later that evening, Joseph returned to his modest apartment, the first home he'd had in years. He sat by the window, the soft glow of the city lights stretching out before him. On the small table next to him was a framed photograph of Amelia and Sophie, their smiles frozen in time. Joseph reached out, his fingers brushing against the glass. "I hope I'm making you proud," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. For the first time in years, he felt at peace. Meanwhile, across the city, Officer Brad was wrapping up a shift at the shelter where he now volunteered. He carried trays of food, his once pristine uniform replaced by a simple t-shirt and jeans. The people he served greeted him not with fear, but with gratitude. Brad had found his own second chance, inspired by the man he had once wronged. The city itself was healing, one small step at a time. Acts of kindness were no longer rare. They were expected. People had learned to look each other in the eye, to see beyond appearances, to care. It wasn't just Joseph who had arisen. It was everyone. In the end, Joseph's story wasn't just about one man. It was about all of us. About the power of forgiveness, the strength and compassion, and the hope that lives in every second chance. And as Joseph closed his eyes that night, he knew one thing for certain: the world could be cruel, but it could also be beautiful. All it needed was a little more kindness.